messed something up. That was just way too much. I'm real nervous about this. Hey drivers, we're continuing with the Hard Times engine rebuild, working on Krusty today. We have things that we need to clean up, fix, and modify, but before we even bother with any of that, there is one totally non-negotiable issue that we have to check, and that is the number 2 bearing web here. We're just not going to waste time on this case if this part doesn't go all the way up against this part. We have oil for the number 2 main bearing comes out of here and needs to go all the way around, but if these two halves are not tight together, then we'll have a huge oil leak internally in the case. That's not going to be too good. This is a hard working bearing in an air-cooled VW case. So let's check that out. The way we're going to do that is bolt the 2 case halves together, torque them to spec, at least with the main studs here, and then shine a light through the case to see if we can see any light passing through the gap in between the 2 halves of the case at the number 2 main bearing. Now, to make sure that that goes as accurately as possible, I've already gone through with a piece of fine sandpaper and cleaned off the parting lines. One of the challenges that we have on this case is a ton of corrosion all over it, even on the parting line. And so I've sanded all of that off nice and smooth. Thankfully, it is cleaned up pretty well. I've got a lot of work to do inside the case and everywhere else, but at least the parting line of the case is nice and smooth, and I think we're going to get an accurate look at whether this number 2 main bearing clamps as hard as it should at the center of the case. But I am not seeing any light coming through any kind of a gap in the 2 case halves, so I am happy about that. We're going to move on. I'd like to have a basic idea that these bearing bores are going to actually clamp the bearing securely enough. I've set up my dial bore gauge for the smallest that hole should be, and I'm expecting it to be a little bit larger, hopefully no more than 8/10,000ths of an inch larger than 2.5590. So we'll snake this thing in here. This one has spots where it's actually 1/1000th bigger than the minimum spec. That's actually beyond where we want it to be by 2/10,000ths of an inch. That's kind of what we're getting into here, folks. We'd have a better situation if we just align bored this thing, but of course we're trying to save a few bucks. We'll move cautiously forward. The backstory is I have a line boring bar. The bushings are too sloppy on it. It doesn't have any repeatability, so it's gonna have to be fixed, bushings, whatever, and I'm gonna have to fully learn how to use the thing before I can line bore cases. So I'm trying to put that off for another day. I'm looking for a case for right now that doesn't need a line bore. And I think that fits with what you might be facing if you're really trying to keep your costs low. It really helps if you can start off with a case that needs minimal, if any, machining whatsoever. So here's what I've been doing. We're dealing with a non-ideal case. So when we measure the bearing bores, I think it's a good idea to measure in a bunch of spots. A general consensus would be to pick 3 spots in the main bearing bore and average all of them. But here's the thing. You can see the stripe in there. That lines up with the groove in the main bearing. That's an oil groove. And so where that groove is, it is not pushing on the case. And if I chose along that stripe to take my measurement, it's going to turn out perfect most, if not all of the time. And it's not providing any bearing crush. You see, we want this bearing to be squeezed in there, right? By 1 to 2/1000ths of an inch, depending on who you ask. But whatever we do, we want this hole to be smaller than this bearing. And so the actual bearings that we're using and the size of our main bearing bore all really come into play here. Plus this issue with that stripe that we want to avoid. So what I've resolved to do is to measure above and below the oiling groove and on either side of the parting line. And I did a similar thing over here. This is the dowel pin. So I went above and below the oiling groove on both sides of the dowel pin. And I'm averaging all of those measurements to figure out what kind of bearing crush we have. Ideally, all of these measurements would be the same, so we'd have a round hole with parallel sides. We really don't want much variation here. I'm using an incomplete spreadsheet to do all of this. In fact, I'm developing the spreadsheet as we go. But to keep this simple, we just barely squeak by. And we've only looked at the first bearing. But this is what's so exciting about the whole thing. Once you really dive into the numbers, you're thinking, okay, well, I can get another set of bearings, which might be a little thicker. You could go from a loser to a winner just like that because you found another set of bearings at a swap meet or something, and they happen to be just microscopically thicker than the last set of bearings. With this old stuff, we've got even more variables in play. To give you an example of that, I've got 3 crankshafts that I'm looking at. One of them really seems like a bad idea. One of them has standard journals, the other one has been turned down. And so I've got a set of bearings that fits the crank that I'm not leaning towards that are just microscopically larger. See, we can switch out one cruddy old crank for another because the bearings that we have for it fit with the case that we're measuring, and this is really the trip that we're on. We're trying to find a collection of parts for this engine that are all in about the same state of not so great. As long as they cooperate with each other, right? If the question is make this case work or don't have a running VW, we're going to accept a little bit more. So you kind of feel where I'm coming from. I'm speaking directly to the people that are in a situation like mine where you don't have a bunch of money to spend on a thing and you're willing to take a little bit less of an outcome just to stay on the road for now, and then in better times we can put a more serious engine together with a little bit of experience under our belt. Let's move on. So we'll snake this thing in here and see what it tells us. So it looks like this is bigger. And that is where I ran into big trouble. The number 2 main is always suspect because it has a hard life. If we look at a VW crankshaft, this is the number 2 main bearing journal right here. This is a cross-drilled crankshaft, which is a cool thing. But what it has to cope with is the fact that the rod journals on either side of it are together. Seems like it would have been better for the number 2 main anyway, if one rod journal was here and the other one was over here to provide a little bit of a counterweighting effect, but for whatever reason, that's not the way they did it. Maybe it would have caused the world to spin the opposite direction too, I don't know, but this is the way it is. And so that split main bearing in the middle of the case gets pushed back and forth. So it's in this part, this is the horizontal part of the case here, that's where it really takes a beating as it copes with all of the pressures coming from the pistons and the combustion process and all that. So, bummer, we're gonna have to learn something. Here's the thing that was so weird. It passed the feel test, right? We have this thing where we drag a fingernail across the main bearing bore, and if it catches on a little ridge, then that's a great indication that it needs to be a line board. Well, this one passes that test, but it did not pass the measurement test. So that's something for us all to keep in mind. For comparison, here is a case that I had recently disqualified because it does not pass the fingernail test. That my fingernail definitely catches on that little ridge there, but I went ahead and measured it and it passes the measurement test. So there are no rules anymore, folks. We're going all out here. And so what this project has turned into is a huge exercise and learning experience. So I'm trying to figure out how to make this old Portatool work. It's worn out, it has 2/1000ths of slop in the main bushing and almost as much in the small end bushing, and I've never line bored a case. I'm a hobby mechanic. I'm working out of my garage, and this is not the standard thing for folks like us to have. But I've got it, and I'd be silly not to try and make it work. So this is the boring bar here. These bushings wedge into the end of the case. This one goes where the oil seal actually installs, and this one goes, well, actually this way around, where the pulley sticks in to the case. Here's a look at one of the cutters. You see the number 1 cutter installed there. Number 2 is ready to be measured. Here's the number 3 cutter. They're all the same, but I number them and install them in exactly the same place each time. I've been dressing the cutter tip here, kind of learning how to do that. I like to have a little bit of a round nose on it to help smooth the finish a little bit. But other than that, it's a pretty simple cutter design. This is the measurement tool. I actually had to fabricate this because my boring bar, it was like a swap meet special and had some extra parts and had some missing parts. So I made this thing last time I was playing around with the boring bar, and I think I finally figured out how to use it. Now what I want to set up for today is a cut that would be the third oversize. I want to measure the tip at its furthest arc out, because that's what will be contacting the metal inside the engine case. So as it arcs past the tip of the micrometer, watch this number over here climb. We're at 11 and change, and at some point it'll peak. Hopefully it peaks right there at the measurement we want. This is 0.7898-ish. So I think we're good here. We'll do the rest of them the same way. I made a huge mistake on one of these practice cuts, which is, you know, the idea of practicing, but these little lines down here, I was over one line, and that was an extra 25 thousandths of an inch onto my cutter measurement, which meant I was cutting 50 thousandths of an inch, because this is a circle, right, beyond where I wanted to be. It was a huge cut. It damaged the tip of that bit where I made that mistake. Doesn't feel like it was very good for the bar either, or the cutter. So making that gross overcut means I don't have any meat left to involve the number one main bearing in this one. So it's just going to ride. 2 is all set up. So I'm going to make sure it's clean. Slide it onto the bar. Want to make sure that the cutter, oops, this is why I double check. Want to make sure that the cutter is facing the correct direction. Looking at some of these practice cases from when I messed with this a number of years ago, I think at least one of them might have been on there backwards because the cut was a huge mess. I was afraid to destroy all my cases. I was kind of stumped, and now I think I have something to go on. All right, let's do the number 3. I'm going to set this one the same way. Then we'll load up the bar and take a cut. It's got this little oiling hole on the top, so I'll put it in this way. This really doesn't seem like the most accurate way to center the main bearing bores. If you think about the 2 parts, they're not the most precision part of the engine, and that's where the pulley goes in. The stock method here is for this little spiral to pull air into the engine, believe it or not. But this is the inlet on the crankcase ventilation. So it's always pulling in crud. Any crud that can get up in here goes into the engine through this little spiral. So you can expect this area to have some wear on it, but that's what we're using to center this thing. And then on the back, it's the oil seal. So assuming that the oil seal was machined as accurate as everything else, then I guess we're okay. But I think what we end up with is a crank center line that is not on the parting line of the case, and we'll measure for that. My fix is to include that in the measurements we make when we deck the spigot bores. The thing that worries me about this bar is I feel a little bit of play. That would have to translate in some way to a lack of accuracy. This is one of the older models that has a hydraulic feed unit. I think there was a more advanced version that came a little bit later, but again, happy to have anything. When I saw it at the swap meet, I really had to make a leap of faith because I knew what it was. I knew it had some wear on it, and I had no great way to know if it would work. And I still haven't proven that it's going to work for me here years later. There's just too much to gain by having a working line bore bar, especially at the price of cases these days. We're going to oil each bushing a little bit, and WD-40 is said to be the thing that gives us the nicest finish, so put a liberal amount of WD-40 in here. All right, gonna close the thing and go for it. Felt good, everything was consistent. Let's take it apart, take some measurements. And our hole is smaller by about 1.8, 1.9. So this is going to give us way too much bearing crush. I calculated in 2/1000ths just in case the holes ended up too big and all of these are ending up too small. So we're in the 3/1000ths plus, which is too much bearing crush. We want between 1 and 2/1000ths of an inch. I'm going to go straight to the number 2. Looks like 3/1000ths smaller. I'm just not hitting my measurements. I gotta wonder if I've got all of the math right. I am certain that there's somebody way more experienced than me that already knows all of this stuff, but in my mind there is no replacement for discovery. It's the long way around, and a person makes a lot more mistakes along the way, but it's a whole lot of fun. I'm gonna set up for a first oversize on an old case. Now this is one that I think is somewhat viable. This is a good crusty case if the other one doesn't work out or whatever. Also, it's a single oil relief. We only have the one oil relief there. Don't have the dual oil relief that we see on the later cases up here. So it's not as desirable of a case anyway. It's got case savers, which is good, but it's 10mm studs, which is not as good. One really banged up head stud here, so we might do something creative with that if we end up using it. I don't know, but we're going to try and do a first oversize. I don't think that's going to be enough to clean up the drama that's on here, but that's all right. We'll set it up, take a look at the results, and ultimately, if this case is ever going to be used, we'll have to go to a second oversize, and we'll need to do a thrust cut, which I've never done. This engine came on my 68 double cab, and at the time it had an 1/8 inch of end play. So the thrust is a mess. We'll have to clean that up too and figure out how to do it first. But here we go, learning a little bit more. Also trying out a homemade bit in the number 4 bearing. I was having trouble with the old one. It was just down to a nub. What I'm curious about now is if it measures out decent, and also how did that homemade bit work? What kind of finish do we have? Is it still the same shape it was? Like, is the tool still that I used up to the task, and so on? There's a lot of questions here. This is getting exciting, folks. A bit of a breakthrough here. The numbers on these bearing bores much closer to what I was looking for. Things are starting to get more predictable. No real surprises on this one, so I didn't mess anything up. Plus, the bit that I used this time on the number 4 bearing is a homemade bit. I used high-speed steel and ground this bit by hand, dressed it, and it has worked well also. I don't think it's quite as nice of a finish as the carbide tipped bits, but it's accessible. These old Portatool bits are made out of unobtainium these days. They're not something standard to my knowledge, so being able to grind my own bit out of commonly available stock is a real plus. So I am very encouraged. Looking forward to doing a real cut. Gonna drag Krusty out again. We're gonna do a half cut to the first oversize on it and see where we are. And if we're confident, we're gonna go the rest of the way. Put a lot of time into this, but it's really been fascinating, and it's been an excellent exercise to do what machinists do all day, and that's pay attention to a billion little details. We're going to cut the Krusty case. I've set up all of the bits. Uh-oh, I got one of them backwards. See? Awesome. Okay, that's better. I've spent a considerable amount of time today dressing these bits and understanding a little better what I need to do there. Still some progress to be made, but each time I do a cut, I'm usually messing with something about the process or the quality of the tool or something and making these incremental improvements. So it's got me to a point where my numbers are being a little bit more consistent. Those numbers are a lot closer to each other than what I've been seeing. So I hope to continue that. I did go back through this case and take my measurements for I don't know what time, just to make sure that this is the right thing to do. So we're gonna go ahead and do about a 10,000th of an inch cut here. That's a half of an oversize. That'll set me up well for doing a decent cut for the actual oversize. Gives me one more run here to decide if I'm ready or not to make that cut. All right, let's put it all together, see how it goes. Mess something up. Okay, I did in fact really mess up the number 2 main. When I was setting up the cutter, see all these little lines here? Each one of those is 25 thousandths of an inch. You go up the dial 25 thousandths of an inch, and well, I was too far that way by one of those little lines, so I was making a measurement that was 25 thousandths too long on the cutter, which translates to a cut that is 50 thousandths too big. The bad news with this is I just took a ton of possible life out of that case. The other bad news here is that I've made this mistake before. I've already learned this lesson. I think just paying attention would really help on a case that was actually important to me. So this one stings a bit. The good news is it's not that great of a case to begin with. This is the crusty case, and there's several other things that can go wrong that may make all of this a moot point. Not gonna get too upset over it. Gonna get all the information, gonna sleep on it a little bit since I'm fumbling around with all of this stuff, and then decide exactly how to proceed. Click this video now to see how we dig in our heels and keep the project alive. It's time to learn a little bit about an engine lathe. We'll see you in the next video.